Folds of Honor Part 3. We finally reached the fun stuff. We're actually going to start putting paint down on these parts. So let's dive in. I'm going to start this repair off working on the front fender for a very specific reason. In most cases, when it comes to custom painted motorcycles, the fuel tank is generally the focal point. That's the first thing people see, whether they're just walking up to the bike to check out the paint job or they're actually sitting on the motorcycle itself. The fuel tank is normally the focal point with custom painted bikes. I'm pretty confident in the colors that I've mixed up in order to perform this repair, but occasionally once you start putting paint onto the surface next to the existing colors, you'll see that, yeah, I could probably adjust this a little bit more one way or the other. If that winds up being the case, I would rather get that ironed out on the front fender, which is not the main focus on the motorcycle, versus the fuel tank. That way everything is squared away and ready to go when I actually do the repair on the fuel tank. So the first step is to get some of these areas masked off. I'm using custom creative fine line vinyl tape here. This is an 1/8 inch roll. It was recently given to me by my friends over at spraygunner.com to try out, and it's a good quality vinyl tape. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can pick this stuff up at the Spray Gunner website. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually running this tape line on the inside of the stars portion on this fender. And there's a very thin silver outline around the outside of the blue. So I'm running the tape along the edge of that silver outline. And what that's going to do is give me a better idea of where the edge is, since I can't see through this vinyl. And since I'm doing this on camera, it's very difficult for me to kind of maneuver around with all the lights and the cameras in the way to get a better angle on it. So this is just helping me to find that edge. Now I'm going to come back in and run another strip parallel with that first strip so that I know I'm on the correct line. So once this strip of tape has been laid down, then I'll peel up the first strip that we just laid down. And ideally, I'll probably have a slight bit of overlap in some areas between the two, but that's good. All I'm concerned about is making sure I have a very clean edge of separation between the silver and the existing red and white stripes behind it. Because once again, the owners of this bike, Folds of Honor Foundation, want to keep as much of the existing paint job as original as possible. So all I'm going to be doing on the fender is pretty much, I'll completely respray the blue and the silver with the stars, and then a little bit of the red and white stripes on the front half of the fender need to be repaired. But other than that, the rest of it is going to stay just the way it is. There you see me removing that first strip of tape, and now I'm going to do the exact same thing for the other silver edge. First running a strip of tape along the inside of the edge so that I can see it better when I actually lay the next piece of tape down. And again, this is more because I was having a hard time seeing where those edges are while I'm trying to film this. I don't normally do this, but it is a good solution if you can't actually see where you need your tape edge, or when you have tape that you can't see through, like this vinyl tape. So burnishing it down, making sure I get that corner, and then I remove the first piece of tape that I laid down. Again, burnishing down those edges. I want to make sure that those are down good before I begin painting anything. And now I'm going to hit the edge of this red stripe here, because what I'm going to try to do for this repair is going to be a little more minimal on this front half. Now I can burnish that end in, and I'll come in with an X-Acto knife and trim these up. You'll notice when I'm trimming the tape, I'm not actually cutting the tape with the blade. I'm laying the blade onto the tape and then I'm pulling the tape against the blade. It gives you a super clean cut and you don't have to worry about cutting through the tape and into the surface that you're going to be painting, which can cause delamination later down the road. At this point, I've got a good outline of the repair areas. So from that point, I come in with just regular 3M automotive masking tape. And all I'm doing here is giving myself a border around that 1/8 inch vinyl tape in order to put paper down to protect all the surfaces that aren't going to get any paint. Okay, so I went ahead and put paper over all of the areas that need to remain protected. I did that off camera just to save some time, and I think I've kind of changed my mind on how I want to approach this. And basically what that comes down to is I'm concerned about building a lot of paint along these taped edges. So my plan at this point has changed from using the Autoborn Sealer Gray as my initial ground coat to going ahead and trying the custom mixed Autoborn White Sealer instead. And again, that's just to alleviate some of the paint buildup on these tape edges. I know there's going to be paint buildup that I'm going to have to deal with either way, but if I can minimize it by a couple coats, because even though I'm spraying all of this with an airbrush, you still get a nasty paint build up on taped edges, even with an airbrush, especially when you have multiple colors to cover in one area. So I'm going to try using the custom Autoborn Sealer White that I've mixed up. So my plan at this point is to come in with the airbrush and the custom white mix, and I'm going to start spraying right in here, and I want to fade the paint back off this way. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to retain this shadow on the right side and blend in this way. And then once that's dry, I'll come back in and I'll mask off the remaining part of this white stripe so that I can try to keep it as original as possible. And then we'll come back in and repaint the red, the white stripe here, and there's another red stripe here, and we'll go from there. That's the plan anyway. It may not work the way that I want it to. If I'm not getting good solid coverage, then I may revert back to using the Autoborn Sealer Gray. We'll see how it works. At this point, I have already mixed up the custom white Autoborn Sealer, and I didn't use as much reducer as I normally do when I'm using an airbrush, because I'm wanting it to cover a little bit better than what it usually does. And for that reason, I'm going to switch to my Iwata HP BCS, which has a 0.5 millimeter needle and nozzle set. So it's a little bit larger compared to my HPCS. So I'll get the brush loaded up and we'll start spraying. There's one thing I want to clarify that I mentioned in part 2. I had said that based on my experience, the Autoborn Sealer White has a hard time covering multiple colors evenly. I was referring to a airbrush application versus a spray gun or even a minigun application. In a spray gun application, I generally will reduce the Autobarn sealers from 10 to maybe 20% at the maximum. In an airbrush application, I generally reduce my Autobarn sealers quite a bit more. Usually it's closer to about a 1-to-1 mix, and that makes it a lot harder for the sealer to do its job, which is why in this case I didn't add as much reducer to this custom mixed white sealer, and I'm pretty happy with the coverage. It actually covered really well. It didn't spray out of the airbrush as well as I would have liked, but it did, as you can see, cover very well. With the sealer sprayed, I allowed this to sit for a couple hours only because I had some other stuff to do. Ordinarily, I would let it sit for about an hour, maybe a little bit more before I actually put tape over the top of it. So here's where we're at. Off camera, I went ahead and masked off the white stripe that we actually faded this base coat sealer into that shadowed area right there. The masking portion of this was exactly the same process as I showed you guys just a few minutes ago. One important detail worth pointing out is you see how I have the masking tape peeled up on itself right here. That's for a very specific purpose. That's to keep from getting a really hard edge when I come back in and spray this area with the white sealer. You guys have already seen me spraying the custom mixed white sealer out of my airbrush, so I'm going to go ahead and shoot this little section off camera just to save a little bit of time, and then we'll pick it up from there. Alright, the white has been sprayed, and I'm sure some of you are probably wondering, based on what I said in part 2 about your underlying colors affecting your colors that are sprayed over those base coats, because I have changed my approach. I didn't spray this white over the gray sealer like I originally intended to. In all likelihood, it will likely change the colors that I'm using to a very slight degree. In this particular case, I don't think it's going to be detrimental because of all the highlights and the shadows that are going to be added later. I think that is going to work to my advantage in disguising if it's off by a little bit. So I've also gone ahead and done some other work off camera. As you can see, I went ahead and masked off the red stripes on the front of this fender. And it again is the same process that I showed you guys just a little bit ago. I used the same Custom Creations fine line 1/8 inch vinyl tape that I used earlier, and then again used just 3M automotive masking tape to fill in the gaps. There's not any major tricks that I'm aware of when it comes to masking off these stripes. I obviously had photographic references that I took prior to this part of the process to use as a reference, but I can't really see exactly what was at the very front lower edge of this front fender, so some of it I had to make up on my own. I did measure the stripes using like a seamstress tape measure prior to this part of the process as well, so I knew roughly how wide they needed to be, but other than that it was just kind of eyeballing it and masking them off. So now we're ready to spray some red. One thing worth mentioning here is notice that I'm still working in light layers, so I'll spray a very light layer of paint, and then I use air and air only from the airbrush in order to dry that coat of paint before I apply additional layers. That pretty much takes care of the red for the front fender. So I'll give this some time, an hour, maybe 2 hours to dry, and then I'll come back in, unmask the silver portion, mask off the red, and then we'll put down some silver. All right, the red has had plenty of time to dry. I've got it masked off and I've unmasked the silver portions, so we're ready to spray some silver. For the silver, I'm going to be using my Iwata HPTH because it's got the fan tip. It helps the metal flakes in the silver to actually lay out a little bit better. You get more even coverage. So let's spray. After the silver was sprayed, I was pretty sure I was going to have to deal with some paint buildup along those taped edges. And I was right. Along the back side of the silver masked edge and on the back side of that first red stripe that we repaired, I had a pretty good taped edge there. And the way that I like to deal with taped edges nowadays differs from the way it used to be. The way it used to be is you would have to clear this with a catalyzed urethane clear and then sand it flat before clearing again. Sometimes on really bad taped edges, you might have to repeat that a couple of times in order to do that. Nowadays, I really like using the UVLS clear for that purpose. So once the silver was sprayed and it had set for about an hour, I unmasked everything and then I shot a couple coats of UVLS gloss clear, not over the entire front fender, just over the repair areas. The UVLS gloss clear is a medium solids gloss clear, so it's got some build to it, and you can use it to minimize those taped edges like I was saying, and you only need to wait about an hour, maybe 2 hours for the UVLS clear to fully cure before you can sand it, compared to a catalyzed urethane, which requires at a minimum 12 hours, sometimes as much as 24 hours. It just depends on the clear you're using. So once the clear had been sprayed, I came in with some 600 grit sandpaper and dry sanded all of that clear, and that allowed me to really knock down the vast majority of those taped edges. I can still feel it very slightly, but that will be super easy to cover and level out with probably one session of a catalyzed urethane clear coat. The UVLS also serves as an inner coat clear because it's actually protecting the underlying paint layers. So it's a great all-around product. It has a number of good uses. From there, I moved on to the shadows. The object here is really just to mimic what the original artist did on the rest of this fender. One thing I noticed on this fender is there's a lot of very grainy spray. It looks like they didn't have the color reduced quite enough, or they had a little bit too low of an air pressure when they were originally painting these shadows and highlights. So I wanted to mimic that. To do that, I wound up not reducing the color as much as I normally would, and that gives you more of a grainy spray because you don't have that really nice atomized paint that really gives you a smooth blend or a smooth fade. So I was using AutoAir Transparent Black for this purpose. It's pretty close to the original color, and although I didn't reduce it that much, I did cut it 1-to-1 with UVLS Gloss Clear, and what that gives me is a really transparent color, which makes it a lot easier to work slowly and build each one of these little shadows up to the value that I actually want, or try to match the values on the rest of this fender. Hopefully you can see in the video that this is a super transparent color. That also makes it easier to blend into the shadowed areas that are pre-existing, because with transparent, as you know, if you continue to go over another shade that's darker, that will darken the original shadow as well. So using a very transparent color makes it a lot easier to meld the two together. Once the shadows were complete, it was time to move on to the highlights. And again, this process is very similar to creating those shadows. The exception that I switched to Auto Air Transparent White, and I didn't cut the white with the UVLS as much as I did the black. I wasn't thrilled about some of the highlights that were already on this fender to begin with, but again, the goal here is to mimic what the original artist did. So that's what I tried to do. Unfortunately, that pretty much wraps up the time we have for part 3 of this series. What do I think about where we're at so far? I think overall, it's looking pretty good. I think it could be a little bit better. Some of you may be wondering if part of the issue would have anything to do with the fact that I chose not to use the Autoborn gray sealer as the initial ground coat and went straight to the custom mixed white sealer. At the end of the day, I don't think it did. If there was any color shift based on the fact that I didn't have the gray sealer underneath the white, it was very, very subtle. I don't think anybody would ever notice that. I didn't notice any change when I sprayed it out. Part of the problem is I second guessed myself when it came to the white sealer. We talked about mixing that white color in part 2, and I actually reverted a couple steps back to a little more on the cream side of that color before I sprayed it out on this fender, and I think that was probably a bad decision. I should have stuck to my initial gut feeling and stuck with the custom mix color that I came up with in part 2. For the tank, I will use the mix ratio that I came up with in part 2. So this color on the front half of this fender is a little more on the cream side compared to other areas of the fender. I disguised that using the transparent black with the shading to some degree. The red also turns out to be a little bit brighter. Wicked Red straight out of the bottle is a little bit brighter than the existing red on the rest of these parts. So for the tank, I will need to adjust that and darken that mixture up just slightly. Again, I compensated for that red being a little bit brighter by using more of the transparent black to mask or disguise the fact that the colors are a little bit off. But at the end of the day, the front of the fender got a little bit darker than I would have liked with the shading. Some of that was not avoidable just because I had to blend into some of these really dark shadows that were already pre-existing. All of this was pre-existing paint, so I had to blend that dark shadow down into the new paint. There's another really dark shadow on this bottom corner. So some of that was unavoidable. A lot of it though, I could have used a little bit less shading, and if the colors were a little bit closer, I could have got away with that. Again, it is what it is at this point. Hopefully the client is happy with it. If not, I'll be repainting it. But I'm overall happy with the way that it turned out. So I hope you guys have got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Once again, I'll leave links in the description below for the Spray Gunner website where you can pick up the custom creative tapes, and I will also leave a link in the description below to all of the airbrushes that I used during this video. So we'll pick this up in part 4. Until then, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio, and I'll see you guys next time.